Okay, welcome back everybody. Hopefully audio and video is working. Yeah, hopefully we're good to go. So today we're going to be starting or going through chapter 6, which deals with genetics and personality. So this is the last of the chapter material that will appear on your first exam. For those of you who are wondering what's this behind me, I'm gonna try using a digital whiteboard, but I don't know if the technology is gonna work or not, so I figured I would just hang something up over my whiteboard in case I need it. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that's a photo of the Trinity test. This was the first nuclear detonation in history, right? So this was the beginning of it all, or the beginning of the end, one we could say. Oppenheimer, J. Robert Oppenheimer, was pretty much the mastermind. Tons of people worked on the project, but he was pretty much the mastermind of the bomb, of the atomic bomb, of developing it. And he saw this explosion live, and he said that he had thought of the quote from the Bhagavad Gita, which is a religious text in Hinduism, and he thought of the quote, "Now I become death, the destroyer of worlds." So it was pretty intense, right? He saw what he had created, and I love the picture just because it's like the duality of man, and reminds me of not to trust humans, but also why I'm so fascinated by them, why I became a psychologist, really, and also the amazing beauty that comes from something so terrifyingly destructive, right? So, enough with that. Let's get to business here. So, chapter 6 deals with genetics and personality. Hopefully, everybody has had an opportunity to go through the chapter, to read through the chapter, if not to at least go through the slides ahead of time. But if not, definitely check them out and read the chapter in preparation for the exam. But we start the chapter off with talking about the human genome, and the genome refers to the complete set of genes that an organism possesses. So the human genome is going to refer to the complete set of genes that humans, as a species, possesses. So the genome contains between 40,000 different genes, and all of these genes are located on our 23 pair of chromosomes, and each person inherits one set of each pair of these chromosomes from their biological mother, and one set from their biological father. And we'll see with the 23rd chromosome, you'll get either an X or Y from your dad, and this is what's going to determine biological sex. So in 2000, well, the Human Genome Project has been going on for quite some time. This is a project dedicated to sequencing the entire human genome. In particular, the purpose is to define or identify the particular sequence of DNA molecules in the human species. And it was in 2000, I believe, that scientists had completed basically the first draft, or the rough draft, of the human genome. And this was pretty remarkable. People thought this was going to take decades and decades to do. It actually was accomplished pretty quickly. So technology tends to do that, speeds things up, because technology tends to speed up exponentially. Excuse me. We call it a first draft or a rough draft because the genome is constantly being updated. The way, as technology improves, the way that different sequences are identified become more sophisticated, and the way that genes kind of get decoded into their various proteins, their various components, becomes more, say, accurate, because the way that genes are actually arranged and the way that they get decoded into these various components or proteins is actually very complex, more complex in humans than in pretty much any other animal species in there. So when we talk about identifying the sequence of DNA molecules, this does not mean that we're identifying the function necessarily of each molecule. So just because we're creating a map of the human DNA structure doesn't really mean that we understand what this map really does, or what it's showing us. That's going to take a very long time, and I think, again, we'll constantly be revising our understanding of this genome as technology progresses and as we revise this sequence here. So most of the genes within the human genome are the same for all humans, so we're way more similar than we are different when it comes to genes. We're actually incredibly similar to chimpanzees, and some of the other great apes. And we have DNA sequences and DNA that we share with plant life, right? So the human genome is pretty complicated. Really, there's a small number of genes that are different for different individuals, including genes that indirectly code for, say, physical characteristics. So we have different genes that are going to produce differences in physical characteristics, but some genetic or personality theorists who are interested in biogenetics will also say that we also have genes, or the humans have differences in genes that will indirectly code for personality characteristics as well. That could be a little controversial, we'll see throughout this chapter. But there they are, except I'm blocking the Y chromosome over there. But these are the pairs that make us. And you can see, hopefully on your screen, or if you're following along with these slides at your own pace, the 23rd pair will either be 2 X's to produce a biological female, and if I weren't blocking it over here, there's Y chromosome. So you get 2 X's, you produce a biological female, you get an X and Y, you produce a biological male. But all those 20 or 30, 40,000 genes all exist on these chromosomes here. So researchers will attempt to determine the degree to which individual differences in personality are caused by genetic and environmental differences. And as I said, this is kind of controversial here for some pretty good reason. We're basically talking about predetermination, right? We're saying that people are just born a certain way, and that kind of suggests that there's really nothing that you can do about that, or it downplays the environmental influences that might lead to certain types of behaviors, or might even lead to differences in physical characteristics. Something like height. You might say, well, height is genetic, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's largely genetic. There's also a environmental component to that that is pretty significant. You can take somebody with tall genes, quote unquote, but who experience severe malnutrition in childhood, and that trait of tallness is not going to be expressed. So we actually see the effects of environment when it comes to height just in past few centuries. Americans, people from the United States, have gotten taller. And if any of you've gone to visit any, of these types of old colonial homes or living museums where they do like these reenactments, but all the buildings are original, you'll notice like the ceilings are pretty low, and also like the height of the doors are pretty low. Why? Well, because we have much better nutrition here, so we're just getting taller as a population as a result of more nutrition and better food. So when it comes to, again, this idea of why this might be controversial, there have been like headlines in the news for years now that this dealing with this idea of quote unquote designer babies, that you'll be able to select not just the sex of your baby, but what eye color they would have, and what physical characteristics that they would have, and it all sounds ridiculous, but it's really not too far off from that becoming a reality, in terms of the science, in terms of the ethics and the legal implications. That might be another story. We also run into a pretty serious issue of eugenics and, making superior races of people, so to speak. Well, I'll show you a video that talks about some of these controversies surrounding eugenics and the whole eugenics movement. Is largely in legitimate science, completely discredited, but you're starting to see kind of resurgence of this among some fringe political groups, ideological groups, since we're starting to see an uptick in nationalistic type of views in terms of politics and social policies. So I have a video coming up at the end of this slide, so I'll just finish this and then we'll learn more about eugenics and the problems with eugenics. So modern psychologists who study personality are typically very concerned about addressing the implications of the type of work that's being done in regard to the effects of genes, particularly this idea that you can breed out undesirable traits and breed in desirable traits. But when it comes to the ethics involved in scientific discoveries, there's two schools of thought. The hardcore scientist should be careful about how their findings are used, but ultimately they should be more concerned with the knowledge itself. Then there's another school of thought that says, no, we should be concerned about the implications of our research, and that the results of our research can have real world consequences and can hurt people. So maybe there's some research that shouldn't be done. And that's kind of a controversial stance to take. And, you can imagine seeing 6 lectures. Well, this is the 6th lecture for me. You can imagine which side of this spectrum I fall on. But yeah, scientists we're supposed to be concerned with the hard, cold facts and not necessarily how that information is used. But I think that's irresponsible. As the scientist, we should be worried about how our findings are used. That's my opinion. Again, not the leading opinion here. Okay, so let's just take a look at this video about eugenics, and then we'll talk about some of the goals of behavioral genetics and studying personality from a genetic point of view. I'm hoping this audio is going to play through the computer. Let's see.
Most famous scientists picked a thing, but a few polymaths like Aristotle and even Sina picked everything. Francis Galton, one of the most important thinkers of the generation after Darwin, fell into column B, hardcore. Galton was a co-founder of a range of scientific disciplines, including meteorology, psychology, forensics, and above all, statistics. He was an active member of the influential British Association for the Advancement of Science. He made the first weather map. Mostly, though, he is remembered for something that we don't even count as science today. Galton was the father of eugenics, the idea that the gene pool of the human species could somehow be improved if certain people with different abilities didn't have kids. Where did Galton come up with such a terrible idea? Partly from the work of his half-cousin, Charles Darwin. When Darwin and Wallace proposed their theory of evolution by natural selection, it was based on observing differences produced by thousands of years of gradual changes. But we, as short-lived humans, can't observe thousands of years of evolutionary change firsthand, so it was very hard to know what to do with natural selection. In the late 1800s, no one really understood how heredity worked. But many biologists, most notably Herbert Spencer, argued that survival of the fittest applied to humans, just like other species. So they figured there must be a technical way to use that knowledge. Spencer, for example, argued against all laws that limited class conflict, which he saw as tests of fitness, including basic child labor laws. Spencer's idea, called social Darwinism, influenced a lot of people in the late 1800s, and one of them was Darwin's younger cousin, Francis Galton. Born in 1822 to a prominent Quaker family, Galton was a child prodigy. Like Darwin, Galton was largely self-taught, a gentleman of science. Also, like Darwin, he never did well in school, suffered from nervous breakdowns, and traveled widely. Unlike Darwin, Galton was not a shy scholar. He was obsessed with the idea of genius, whether it was a product of good hereditary luck or learning. For Galton, as for most Victorians, nature held all the cards. He got this idea from his cousin's hit book. On the Origin of Species blew Galton's mind. After 1859, Galton focused on the social implications of Darwin's work. He argued that an organism's most important characteristics must be biological rather than shaped by environment or experience. And, like Darwin, he sought evidence for his theory. The first step was to pick some trait to track over time. He selected eminence, which today you might think of as basically awesomeness. Galton thought that if human traits can be inherited, then tracking the descendants of obviously eminent men, and of course they were men, should show a decreasing level of eminence over time as intermarriage with non-eminent people diluted this trait. So he gathered all of the historical evidence he could on eminent British men and their descendants, and indeed found that eminence seemed to decrease over time. The resulting book, Hereditary Genius, published in 1869, contains the very first use of the phrase nature versus nurture. The book also, by the way, includes a chapter on eminent wrestlers of the North Country. Hereditary Genius popularized the practice of historiometry, or studying human traits by tracking ancestry information. But Galton knew he was barely scratching the surface on heredity. He needed more evidence, so he did what his cousin would have done. He turned to a model from nature. This time, twins and peas instead of pigeons and barnacles. In 1875, in the paper The History of Twins, he proposed studying twins, which he saw as a natural experiment. By the mid-1900s, twin studies became the foundation of behavioral genetics, or how heredity affects behavior. Galton realized that twins presented a natural experiment. If nature is more powerful than nurture, then twins should be more similar than not, even if they're raised apart. But if nurture is more powerful, then twins should behave differently when raised apart. Galton didn't conduct his own twin studies, but he did outline what future research should look like. Galton also developed statistical methods to research inheritance, and in doing so, he created the quantitative science of human behavior. Thought bubble, show us how. Galton also started breeding sweet peas, comparing the sizes of the offspring of different seeds. Galton's work with peas led him to conclude that traits tend toward a statistical average. Galton couldn't figure out why, but he could use statistics to model the general pattern of how traits were distributed over time, in this case, in a normal distribution, a bell curve. In 1884, Galton took his pea model to the International Health Exhibition in London. Visitors to his anthropometric lab paid to have Galton measure their bodies, minds, and senses in various ways. He produced many new instruments in order to measure, for example, eyesight. Visitors received the results, and Galton also kept a copy to add to his library of research on variation in humans. This practice, known as anthropometry, or literally measuring humans, became common across many disciplines. Galton also pioneered the use of fingerprinting in forensics. He classified the features that we still look for: loops, whorls, and arches. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So Galton built on Darwin's work to invent a statistical science of life. But now it gets weird and frankly difficult, because Galton decided that based on his investigations on inheritance, good traits such as genius and morality were diluted down to some norm over time. In 1883, 1 year after Cousin Chuck passed away, Galton published Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, in which he coined the term eugenics, the discipline of good breeding, or literally making good families in humans. Galton was not the first person to suggest that smart people should have kids with each other, or that cousins should avoid marrying. What Galton did was argue, based on what he saw as scientific evidence, for the public to do something about these ideas. He wanted families of merit to grow, and he thought the government should incentivize this growth. This was called positive eugenics. Galton pointed out that many well-born Victorians married late and had few kids compared to the lower classes. If this fear of the weakening of supposedly good stock by new or poor or different people sounds familiar, that's partly because Galton's so-called science of eugenics quickly gained traction. The first International Congress of Eugenics was held in 1912, the year after Galton died, and it was around this time that nations began passing eugenical laws, particularly the United States. Driven by a fear that births of supposedly inferior people would lead to weak or criminally degenerate adults, some states introduced forcible sterilization laws starting in 1907. These were mostly used to justify the sterilization of already incarcerated groups and those with different abilities. This was negative eugenics, which was not something Galton had explicitly argued for. The metaphor used by eugenicists was drawn from Darwin but modified. A family or nation was a tree, and its branches sometimes needed pruning. A famous example of this thinking in the United States was psychologist Henry Goddard's 1912 book about a family from New Jersey called the Kallikaks. This was a made-up name for a real family whose genealogy Goddard studied to understand what he called feeble-mindedness or intellectual disability. In the book, Goddard compared the branch of the Kallikak family that was descended from its founding father's legitimate marriage and the branch that descended from that father's affair with a, quote, nameless feeble-minded girl. Goddard concluded that feeble-mindedness was strongly heritable and a danger to democracy. Although he later admitted that this was a flawed study, it was a hit, and his terms for different levels of intelligence became common: moron, imbecile, idiot. Goddard's attempts to quantify intelligence weren't at the fringes of science. His ideas are creepily still with us in the form of intelligence quotient, or IQ tests. Goddard, who was a big-time fan of Galtonian eugenics, translated the work of 3 major French psychologists in 1910. This translation was picked up by Louis Terman at Stanford University, who adapted the work of the French to create the Stanford-Binet intelligence scales in 1916. Goddard and Terman then worked with Robert Yerkes to develop an IQ IQ test for the US Army in 1917, the US Army introduced aptitude tests to place soldiers in different roles, but the tests were highly discriminatory, privileging white candidates from educated backgrounds. This trial of the test showed very low results for non-Northern European whites and non-whites. Goddard spent much of the rest of his life publicizing these results, even though they were contested in his own day as shoddy science. There were so many other serious Galton-inspired scientists who did creepy research on human difference and argued for terrible policies. We could do a whole creepy spin-off show. Instead, let's just talk about some of the worst. A lawyer and zoologist named Madison Grant wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916, citing Galton. Grant subdivided Caucasians into 3 types, claiming that the great Nordics were being rapidly outbred in the United States by inferior types of whites. Meanwhile, Charles Davenport, a very influential zoologist, founded the Eugenics Record Office at Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory in 1910. He collected data to help people check whether a potential marriage was suitable, and maybe unsurprisingly, Davenport was a fan of the Nazis, but probably the eugenicist most well known to us today was the nurse who coined the term birth control and opened the first US birth control clinic in 1916, Margaret Sanger. Sanger founded the American Birth Control League to educate people about safe abortion procedures and contraceptives. She gave lectures on birth control to many groups, including the KKK in 1926. In the 1920s and 30s, Sanger thought that eugenics would give her movement legitimacy. By the late 1920s, eugenics had been recognized as bad science by most practicing biologists. But as a source of policy for many lawmakers in the United States, Germany, and elsewhere, eugenics was still very much alive. In the 1800s, science had become much more important for states. They wanted to understand their populations, and now shape them. Compulsory sterilization was challenged in the US Supreme Court in 1927 in the famous Buck v. Bell case. But the decision, written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., sided with the eugenicists and has never technically been overturned. In fact, forced sterilization was still happening in California prisons until it was banned in 2014. Did Galton think that studying human difference would lead to bad science and even worse laws? Not necessarily. But in some ways, his legacy, a legacy of comparing humans quantitatively, is still with us. Next time, we'll see what's going on in a less creepy area of the life sciences. It's time for Pasteur.
Okay, so we can see clearly how eugenics is definitely something not good. And this whole idea of forced sterilization, it's happening now. If you follow the news at all, or follow some social or political accounts on Twitter, you see that there are numerous reports of undocumented women who are in the custody of Immigration and Customs Enforcement who have undergone forced sterilization. They're being sterilized without their consent, without knowing what these procedures are about. Check it out. It's a developing story, but certainly a concerning one, right? We'll see this idea of creating a pure race was essential to Nazi philosophy, Nazi ideology. Some bad things that come out of eugenics and social Darwinism in general, right? Okay, so most behavioral geneticists or psychologists who are interested in studying the genetic, the genetic influence in personality are not eugenicists. They are not social Darwinists, but I thought it was important to show you that video to know that, yeah, this shit exists in our history as psychologists. It's part of our field. And hopefully when you take 222, or if you've taken 222 methods too, when you learn about research ethics, you learn about a number of really shitty things that psychologists have done. So it's part of our history. It's important that we recognize that so we don't repeat it, right? Okay, so some goals of behavioral genetics. When we talk about genetic research, research has confirmed that roughly 90% of the individual differences in, say, something like height are due to genetic differences, and that only about 10% of something like height is due to environmental causes. So that's to say that height has a lot of heritability. It's highly heritable. However, that 10% of environment still could have massive and very meaningful differences. That 10% that is due to the environment. Like we said before, we just see that the Americans, people from the U.S. or what was the U.S. Before we were actual country or colonists, we've actually grown literally in height, right? We've gotten taller as nutrition and food has become more plentiful. So it's important to keep in mind that even when we do see some traits that are highly genetic or heritable, the part that's not, that environmental aspect, is still incredibly important. Okay. So some of the goals of behavioral genetics is to determine what percentage of these individual differences can be attributed to differences to genetic differences, and the percentages that can be attributed to environmental differences. Another goal would be to determine the ways in which genes and the environment interact, and in the ways in which they correlate with each other to produce individual differences. So there is nothing that is 100%, no behavior or attitude or trait, whatever it is we're going to be talking about in this chapter. There's not a single one that is 100% environment. There's genetic, rather. Sorry. There's really nothing about us that is 100% genetic. It's always going to be not a debate of nature or nurture. It's always going to be nature and nurture. It's always going to be genetic and environmental. The goal of behavioral genetics, or the researchers who study behavioral genetics, is to determine what proportion is which, right? Which proportion is nature, which proportion is nurture. So final goal is to determine precisely where in the environment are the effects taking place. So we know genes. We have the human genome, trying to figure out exactly where in the genome these genetic differences lie, right? Which genes are responsible for which behavior or attitudes, or responsible for which characteristics, even physical characteristics. And again, usually not a single gene. It's usually a sequence of genes that have to be switched on and off. You can think about something like eye color, right? There's not a single gene that determines eye color. So that's an example of how even just a physical trait that we have is going to be determined by multiple genes in there. So when we talk about the environment, they might also be, instead of looking within our DNA sequence where these genetic differences are coming from, but taking a look in terms of our environmental differences. Where exactly in the environment are these effects taking place? Is it happening in the way that we were raised, in the way that we were socialized by, let's say, our parents, or in school, the influence of our teachers or our peers or our culture in general, right? So when we talk about genetics and getting half of our genes from one parent, half of the other, and the different, and trying to examine which traits are passed down. We're talking about what traits are heritable, right? So we need to define what exactly is heritability. And we could think of heritability as the proportion of the observed variance in a group of individuals that can be explained or accounted for by genetic variance. So what does this mean? Heritability, well, let's just keep the focus there on group of individuals, right? So heritability is the proportion of differences that we see in a group that can be explained by differences in genes. So the formal definition of heritability is the proportion of phenotypic variance that is attributable to genotypic variance. And what's phenotypic variance, you might ask? Phenotypic variance is the observable differences that we see, right? So these are the differences between individuals that we can observe, that we can measure. And we say that heritability is the proportion between the phenotypic differences, these observed differences, as it relates or as it's accounted for by genotypic variance. So you might ask, what's genotypic variance? Well, that's how much we actually differ in our genes, right? So we could think of genotypic variance as referring to individual differences in the total collection of genes that a person has. So if we think of heritability as a statistic, or well, as a proportion is how we think of heritability. We might say, some trait has a heritability of 0.5, right? So we say this trait has a heritability of 0.5. What do we mean by that? Well, it means that 50% of the observed trait, of those observed differences, what we're reviewing, 50% of that is attributable to differences in genes, or 50% of that behavior, this trait, this whatever it is, can be explained by genetics. The other 50% is going to be explained by the environment, and that's where this notion of environmentality comes into play. Sorry, not feeling very well. I'm hoping it's just allergies or something here. But that's where this notion of environmentality comes into play. So environmentality is the proportion of observed variance in a group, or that phenotypic variance that is attributable to environmental variance. So if something is 50% genetic, let's say, the other half is going to be environmentality, right? Due to environmentality. So either way, those two are going to have to add up to 100%, that proportion. So we could think about environmentality also in terms of the environmental contribution to that phenotypic variance, to that observed difference that we see. How much of it is being caused by the environment. So something that is highly heritable, meaning something that is very highly influenced or accounted for by genetic differences, is going to be low in environmentality. And some phenotypic variants, some observed trait or some observed difference that's very high in environmentality is going to be low in genetic or genotypic variance, right? So it's going to be more nature or more nurture and less nature, so to speak. Okay, so some misconceptions about heritability. Well, one is that it cannot be applied to a single individual. We never talk about heritability as it pertains to a single person. So for individuals, genes and the environment are so intertwined. They're so mixed up. There's no way that a person could easily try to untangle our genetics and our environment and our experiences in terms of trying to parse out which is responsible for which of our beliefs and behaviors and emotions. So when we talk about heritability, we never apply it to individuals. We are always talking about overall, like in the population, right? So it's always talking about a large group, well, sometimes a sample of people as well, right? But definitely large groups of people, not individuals. So we always have to be very careful when speaking about heritability and say the proportion of an observable trait that we can explain through genetic differences. We're talking on average, right? On average, it's not in a single person. So that, has to, that's a big one. Another, say, misconception is that heritability is constant, when in fact it's not constant. It can, let's say, change depending on which group that you might be studying. So a particular observation or a particular trait might be, say, more easily passed down in, say, Irish people than in, say, Nigerians or something, right? So different groups of people, different ethnic groups or racial groups or groups based on location even might have differing rates in terms of the heritability of certain traits. So it's not constant, and this idea that heritability is something that is even a reliable statistic or a reliable measure is not true. It's a pretty imprecise statistic that we're talking about here, heritability, when we're trying to determine the proportion of an observed event or an observed characteristic, the proportion that's attributable to genes versus environment. I mean, we're really just making estimates at that point. There's a lot of error and a lot of unreliable methods that are used. We'll talk about there's some methods that are better than others, and there are ways to measure some of these differences. But again, we have to speak in terms of generalities because it's not a precise statistic. You might hear me, just even the tone of my voice, it's like I'm trying to find words that try to really express caution in using something like heritability. It's well, we'll see some of the problems that exist. We already saw some of the problems that exist with this notion, and as a social psychologist, you can understand how I'm really, really very cautious in talking about this stuff, because by and large I think it's bullshit. But I'm teaching it to you because there's some aspects to it that the science is undeniable. Yeah, I have to concede genetics does likely play some role. I was gonna say how big of a role. is debatable, and we should really be careful when we're putting people into certain categories or making prejudgments of people based on their genes, right? This is bad things happen when we do that. So it's best in terms of, say, talking about heritability again. It's best to just think of heritability as an estimate of a percentage or proportion of something that we're looking at, some difference that exists in an individual or in a group of individuals, right? We never focus on an individual, so some individual difference though that exists in a population. What's the estimate that that difference can be accounted for by genetic differences versus environmental differences? Okay, so this is again getting into the nature and the nurture debate. Just to clarify, there is no such debate at the individual level. So why? Because we never apply the notion of heritability to an individual or an individual's behavior or their personality, anything about them. We apply it to generalities in the population or large samples. So no such debate at the individual level. Also, influences of genes and environment is only relevant at the level of the population, and this is again kind of where I say I'm willing to concede that it could be important to see in certain if there are certain genetic components to different diseases, and even some more clearly different diseases. That way we can try to develop genetic treatments for them. But even when it comes to certain disposition, if there's certain genetic variants or some genetic differences that might explain something like predisposition to aggression. That could be important in helping us as psychologists try to understand how best to go about, say, treating something like aggression, which can lead to criminal activity and violent activity. So there's definitely some benefit in understanding the role of heritability at the population level. I get very, very worried, I don't know, unhappy when we apply it at the individual level. Now, when we take a look at selective breeding, which is essentially what eugenics is all about, selective breeding is also known as artificial selection, right? So it's not the opposite of natural selection, but it's on the spectrum of selection. Natural selection is when nature selectively breeds for us. Won't teach you the whole theory of evolution here, but essentially, there are multiple theories of evolution, and people actually define evolution in different ways. But there is the theory of natural selection that comes from evolutionary theory, and it says that certain traits, genetic certain differences in genes are going to produce traits that are going to, those traits that are more adaptive to the environment that the individual, not the individual, I can't talk as a psychologist without mentioning the individual, but certain genetic differences may be more advantageous to a group of, say, humans or to a species for the particular environment that they're in. So if you have a gene that is more likely to, say, produce really pale skin like me, right? Really pale, pasty skin like me, that could actually be a benefit if you're from Ireland, right? Or if your ancestors are from Ireland, which gets like even less sun than Oneonta does, right? And it gets about as much rain. The only good thing about the climate in there is that it's very mild. You don't get the like snowstorms or these horribly cold winter temperatures, but it's kind of dreary country. It's not really though. It's beautiful. So much greenery because of all the rain. But I'm starting to go off on a tangent here. The idea is that, having paler skin in more northern and climates or locations rather, where you're not getting a whole lot of sun, might allow for more production of vitamin D, which we need to survive. So some of my pasty evolutionary ancestors in Ireland probably did pretty well, or at least they had an advantage to those who were less pasty and blocked out more of the sun, and had lower levels of vitamin D production. Just as an example. Conversely, someone like me would not do very well living in a hot climate with a lot of sun, right? Might even look a little bit red just because I was installing some solar panels over the weekend, so I had like 5 hours in direct sunlight, and I didn't put on sunblock, so I'm already like, ugh, that was stupid of me. I need sunblock to like sit in front of the TV, or I'll get a sunburn. That's how bad I am. So just getting back to what we were saying here. So some traits or genetic differences might serve as an advantage in a particular environment, and some traits might serve as a disadvantage in particular environments. So if you have some genes that produce some traits that is going to make life a little bit easier for you based on the environment that you're in, you might have an evolutionary advantage. You're going to probably live longer, have access to more food, be healthier, have access to more mating opportunities, and thus pass on those helpful genes. Now, those same genes that are producing these characteristics might be detrimental in a completely different environment, right? So, again, environment is important when we take a look at this stuff. So, natural selection basically does it for us. It selects the desired characteristics, not really desired so much as the advantageous characteristics in your environment. But humans have been doing selective breeding since forever, right? Pretty much since recorded history, at least. And we see this most, let's say, profoundly in dogs. All dogs from a lab. I have 2 black labs, and my neighbor has these 2 little runty, yappy dogs. I don't know what they are. They're adorable, but oh my god, the barks. Yep, right? They say that the only difference, or how the differences came about between, let's say, even a German Shepherd and a Poodle, all came about because of selected breeding by humans. We created all of these breeds of dogs. So a dog is a dog is a dog. It's the same species. They all have the same common ancestor. A lot of people, or some research will say, dogs are all dogs are descendant from, the gray wolf. But there's some research to suggest that actually gray wolves, and what are now dogs, are actually both descendants of an extinct, common ancestor. The point being is that we selectively breeded traits to produce Labrador retrievers, and to produce beagles, and to produce German shepherds, and to produce Rottweilers. That was all us, even the Chihuahua, right? So that was all selective breeding. Humans use selective breeding or artificial selection to create the best and hardiest types of crops. Go take a look at what corn used to look like when the Europeans first came to the Americas, compared to what corn looks like now. It was all done through artificial selection. Maybe a more appropriate, or at least timely, example is take a look at all the different strains of cannabis that exist now. You have some strains that go up to 20, almost reaching 25% THC content. That's unheard of. That's not naturally found. Let's say in cannabis strains that have not been artificially selected. Even the weed from my teenage years, where you could smoke like a joint or two, and to kind of, or you would have to smoke a joint or two to kind of get the same feeling you get from like one or two hits nowadays. And that's all, again, the result of artificial selection or selective breeding of plants. Now, clearly, the fact that we can do this means that heritability is a thing. The fact that selective breeding has been so successful with dogs and with cannabis even, tells us that heritability, well, maybe not with cannabis, but with dogs, different breeds of dogs are known to exhibit different personality traits, right? So some dogs are known to be more aggressive than others. Some dogs are known to be more playful than others. Some more agreeable than others. So something I'm just thinking in my head, that none of my dogs are, neither one, are agreeable. Well, they don't listen to me. And they're labs. They're supposed to be, but that's because they're spoiled. So there you go. The effects of environment, of bad parenting on my part there. But the fact that we were able to produce all these different breeds that have not just different physical characteristics, but also different, I'd say, personality characteristics, suggests that heritability is, is likely responsible in at least in part, for personality, or the development of personality. The problem, of course, is I'm talking about dogs. Just because we're able to use selective breeding to produce these types of desirable traits in dogs doesn't mean that we can do this in humans, particularly when we're talking about personality traits. Human personality is way too complicated, way more complicated than, say, dogs' personality. And that's no disrespect to my canine children and friends, right? it's just the truth. Our humans are just more complicated. We have these big ass brains and these big prefrontal cortexes here that dogs don't have. So, yeah, the idea that it's possible, the idea that heritability is a thing in personality traits among some animals is certainly, it could raise a legitimate question. Well, could it also be a thing in human personality? Yes, some studies are looking at it. The verdict is still out about how much is actually attributed to genetics. But let's be careful. Just because we have these animal models, this doesn't necessarily tell us anything about humans. And of course, we can't ethically do this type of selective breeding with humans. We have codes of ethics, the Nuremberg Code and stuff. After the Nazis tried doing this, and the eugenicists that existed at that time in the United States, that existed within our own field. So no, we can't selectively breed humans as experimenters. Luckily, there are other ways that we can examine heritability without committing crimes against humanity. The first is through family studies. So family studies try to examine the correlation between the degree of genetic relatedness among family members with the degree of similarity in personality. So what does this mean? Well, genetic relatedness, you have to think this means how much of our genes are being shared. Parents and children share 50% of their genes, right? So we get half our genes from our moms and half our genes from our dads. So we're 50% genetically similar, for our purposes here, to our parents. Likewise, we'd be 50% genetically similar to our siblings. When it comes to our grandparents, well, if we're 50% of our parents and they're 50% of their parents, well then we're 25% genetically similar to, say, our grandparents. When we talk about aunts and uncles, it would also be 25%, right? Because let's say just on our mom's side, we share half our genes with mom. Mom shares half her genes with, say, her brother. So our uncle, we share 25% of genes. Say our uncle has a kid, so that kid shares 25 or 50% of uncle's genes. So first cousins, we would share 12.5%, and you can just keep going and going and go and keep having these as you go down the branches of the family tree. So that's what we mean when we talk about genetic relatedness. So family studies are going to look at two people, let's say siblings, who share 50% of their genes, and they would posit, because they share more genes than, say, somebody and a cousin, a first cousin, that the two siblings should be more similar in personality than, say, one person and their first cousin. So you and the sibling should be more similar in your personalities than you and your cousin. You and your mom should be more similar in personality than you and your uncle, or you and your grandma, let's say. Okay, so that's basically what family studies are taking a look at. Taking a look at the correlation between how much genes you share and the degree to which your personalities are similar. So what's the point of this? Well, if a characteristic is highly heritable, family members who have greater genetic relatedness should be more similar. And if a trait is not heritable or has lower levels of heritability, that those differences it's not really going to matter in terms of the genetic, how closely you're related genetically to one another. The problem that comes with family studies is that they can't be viewed as a definitive. So members of family who share the same genes also tend to share the same environment. Sometimes that's the physical environment, but we could also think of the way that, say, things like poverty can run in families, or the way that abuse can run in families. So there's also generational, say, social issues that tend to follow families as well. And some people might say, well, those things, even those things, poverty and abuse, that could be linked to genetics as well. Well, I don't know, maybe. Most of the research that exists, that's generally accepted, shows that, these things tend to run in families because of lack of opportunities and mental illness and things like that. So the issue is that we have a confound here. Are you sure it's the genetic relatedness, or is it more so that you're more likely to have a shared environment or a more similar environment to your siblings than you would your aunt or your uncle, right? Or your first cousin, who might be, they could live in a completely different state or country even, right? And again, we're not talking about individuals, we're talking about in general. The people who share more of your genes, you're more likely to spend, your environment is more likely to be similar. You're living with them, you'd be more likely to live with them. So we run into this confound here. So even though we see that two people who share more genetic material or genetic, they seem to share more genes, and they tend to be more similar in this way. Well, are you sure it wasn't due to environment? Well, we got to think about that. Twin studies try to parse this out, meaning that they try to determine how much of that similarity, let's say between siblings, would be due to their shared genetic makeup or their shared environment. So twin studies in general have shown that identical twins, or monozygotic twins, also known as, are more similar than dizygotic twins or fraternal twins in things like dominance and height, and even ridge counts in fingerprints. So interestingly enough, the identical twins share 100% of their DNA, but even they have unique fingerprints. They're more similar than say, any other person, but they're still unique, which means that the development of fingerprint patterns is also environmentally related, or related to environmental conditions. And I guess one thing that I failed to mention in terms of talking about the environment, we're also talking about the prenatal environment. So basically the environment of the womb in which we're developing. So prenatal environment has been linked to a number of different things. I'm not sure how, what personality traits prenatal environment has been linked to. We'll see in a minute, or later on here. Some personality psychologists will throw sexual orientation into the mix, but sexual orientation is not a personality trait. But they'll throw that in the mix, and there certainly is some interesting research about the relationship between prenatal environment and homosexuality later in life. But we'll get to that in a moment here. So generally speaking, we see that identical twins tend to be more similar than fraternal twins when it comes to certain personality traits, and clearly physical traits as well. Identical twins are called identical for a reason. That's before we even knew what genes were. We called them identical because they look the same, right? So identical twins share 100% of their DNA because they come from a single egg and a single sperm. So they come from one fertilized egg that split into two and created two people. Fraternal twins come from two separate eggs and two separate sperm. Sperm cells. So essentially, fraternal twins they're just your siblings in terms of any other sibling when it comes to genetic makeup. The difference with fraternal twins and say just any other sibling is that fraternal twins share a prenatal environment, right? So they're going to share the same environment in terms of being exposed to the same hormones and proportion of hormones and all of that stuff. So one way that we can say determine, what's the heritability of a certain trait or a certain characteristic that we're observing is, well, some people there's lots of different ways to calculate this type of proportion. But one of them is that you can take the similarity that exists in terms of correlation, right? So you get a correlation of how similar, say, identical twins are on a particular trait, and how similar fraternal twins are on an identical trait, or how similar they are on a particular trait, rather. You take the correlation for the fraternal twin, you subtract that from the correlation between the identical twins, and you multiply that by 2. This would give you a heritability rating, or a heritability statistic, basically telling you how much of that trait is likely due to genetic differences. So an example here, just for our example, we have the correlation that exists between monozygotic twins, so identical twins, minus the correlation that exists between dizygotic twins or fraternal twins, and say something like height. I have it written down here. Height, it's a 0.93. So in terms of correlation between identical twins, there's a correlation of 0.93 when it comes to height. So pretty high. When it comes to fraternal twins, the correlation is 0.48. So we would subtract 0.48 from 0.930, multiply that by 2, and we end up with a heritability coefficient of 0.9, which basically tells us that 90% of height is due to changes or due to differences in genes. That other 10% that's not accounted for would be based or would be due to environmental differences. That also, like I said, I failed to mention, includes prenatal environmental differences as well. Now, the thing with twin studies is that it's based on this idea of equal environments, the equal environments assumption. So, well, there are two issues here when it comes to twin studies. The first is this equal environment assumption. So the twin method assumes that the environments that are experienced by identical twins are no more similar to each other than the environments experienced by fraternal twins. So basically, this assumption that identical twins are treated the same way that fraternal twins are treated. I know 2 sets of identical twins. Actually more than that, because I've had identical twins as students at Oneonta, like once or twice, and I have friends who are identical twins, and I know quite a few pairs of fraternal twins, people who are fraternal twins, and identical twins, not even just speaking from my experience by talking to them, but the research also shows that, identical twins tend to get treated more alike than fraternal twins. Why? Because they look the same, right? There's something special about identical twins. Is that they both look the same. Parents will often dress them exactly the same, give them the same hair color, give them the same toys. Parents kind of, and not just parents, but teachers and friends kind of all expect identical twins to be identical, to be similar, so they kind of treat them that way. And the same is less so for fraternal twins. The effect isn't as strong, right? So are you sure it's really the genetic aspect that's causing identical twins to be so similar, or is it just because you assume they're going to be similar and you treat them that way, so they act that way? We call that a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So that's one issue that comes about. Another potential issue with twin studies is that twins are they might not be representative of the general population from which they came. Remember, when we talk about heritability, we don't talk about the individual. We're talking about populations, and maybe there's something different about twins just in general, particularly when it comes to personality. I don't know, but when it comes to personality, but we do know that overall, twins tend to be born a few weeks prematurely than, say, the rest of us non-twins, and they tend to weigh less than non-twins. So in the population, we see, that there are some difference about twins, that they're not 100% representative of the rest of us there. Okay, so adoption studies can kind of address some of those issues there. Adoption studies are pretty useful, pretty powerful tools in terms of examining behavioral, say, genetics. So in an adoption study, you're able to examine the correlation between adopted children and their adoptive parents. And there's no shared genes between the adoptive parents and the adopted children. So you're able to examine the correlations in terms of similarities of personalities and behaviors among the people who are living together, right? Who are sharing an environment, who are being raised or who are raising somebody who shares zero genetic similarities, except for any other random stranger type of person. So this can help us examine or take a look at the heritability, but also the environmentality that might exist. So in adoption studies, positive correlations between adopted children and their genetic parents can provide evidence for genetic influence. This is, of course, if you're able to get a hold of the genetic parents. Sometimes that's not always possible. But if you're able to identify the genetic parents, you're able to see how similar the adopted child is to their adopted parents or parent, and their genetic parents. And that could help you tease out, how much of this is related to environment and how much is this, and I say this, whatever it is you're looking at, is related to genetics. So adoption studies, we say, are powerful because they help us get around this equal environments assumption. We don't have to assume that that anyone's treated differently in terms of their genetics, because they don't share any genetics, any genetic materials, or any genetic materials. They don't share any of the same genes when it comes to adoptive parents and adopted children. Adoption studies also assume that adoptive children and their adoptive and genetic parents are representative of the general population. So is that true, right? Is that something that we can assume, that there's nothing inherently different between children who are adopted and children who are not adopted, or between parents who adopt children and parents who don't adopt children? Is that a assumption that we should make? Is it a good one to make? Well, it does raise the question of this issue of selective placement in terms of adopted children. And when we talk about selective placement, it basically is referring to whether or not adoptive parents are choosing children who might be more similar to themselves. So is this causing, again, some type of conflation here, that if you're kind of a laid back, chill type of parent, you might be inclined to adopt a child or even an infant who is kind of more calm and laid back and chill. If you're kind of more of an energetic type of person, maybe you're be more inclined to adopt a child who's also more energetic, say assertive or outgoing, extroverted, whatever we would want to, label an infant child. Kind of silly. But maybe adoptive parents are drawn to different qualities within adoptive children, qualities that are more similar to themselves, right? the good thing for adoption studies, at least, is that there have been several studies that have confirmed that the adoptive parents and adoptive children are representative of the population, at least when it comes to, a whole bunch of different factors. That you can't examine every single factor out there to see if they're representative, but on things like cognitive abilities and intelligence, education level, personality, even socioeconomic status, adoptive children, adoptive parents tend to be representative of the population in general. So non-adoptive parents and non-adoptive children. So we don't really have to worry about that representativeness of the population problem so much. The research seems to suggest that's not really an issue. And then when it comes to this issue of selective placement, so if children are placed with adoptive parents who are more similar to them or more similar even to their birth parents, this can kind of inflate the correlation that we see between adoptive parents and their adoptive children. But research also suggests that this doesn't seem to be an issue either. So we don't really have to worry about the selective placement. It doesn't seem to really be happening in real life, let's say. So when it comes to adoptive studies, this final point here, that behavioral genetics, adoption studies can be a pretty powerful design when it comes to the strengths of twin and adoption studies at the same time. Let me just rephrase that. If you combine twin studies with adoption studies, you kind of get the best of both worlds, while minimizing any kind of limitations. And how do you do this? Well, you can study identical twins who have been reared together or reared apart. So basically identical twins who have grown up together and identical twins who were separated at birth. These are two individuals who share 100% of their genes and who presumably had very different, or maybe not very different, but who had different childhood upbringings in different environments. So that can be even more useful in trying to determine the heritability of a particular trait that you're interested in. So just a summary of some traditional behavioral genetic methods. Selective breeding studies, clear advantage in there is that you can actually conduct experiments. You can say, we're going to do it with plants, right? That you could take one plant and pair it with another plant and see what traits emerge in the offspring of that plant. Limitations, clearly, is unethical to do in humans. And even when it comes to selective breeding in other species like dogs, it's not clear that those results can translate to humans to begin with. The method of family studies, advantage is that it provides heritability estimates, right? The limitation is that it violates the equal environments assumption. Twin studies provide both heritability and environmentality estimates. Limitation, it sometimes violates the equal environments assumption. Adoptive studies, an advantage is that it provides both heritability and environmentality estimates, and it gets around the problem of the equal environments assumption, so we don't have to worry about that. Limitation is that adoptive kids might not be representative of the population, and we have the potential issue of selective placement, even though most of the research suggests that neither one of those are a real limitation. That so far, the limited number of studies that have been done on this, on those two potential limitations, suggests that they're not that big of a problem. Okay, so when it comes to personality traits and heritability, how heritable are personality traits? It's hard to say, right? Because these heritabilities are just estimates. But summaries of behavioral and genetic data will yield heritability estimates of about 50% for some of those major personality traits, such as extroversion and agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, openness to experience. Hopefully those sound familiar to you. Those are the Big Five, from the Big Five model of personality. So if you remember, the Big Five model of personality is the model that has the most statistics and the most data behind it. It was actually data driven as it was being formed, as these traits were being identified. It was done through factor analysis. So we see heritability estimates about 50%, which suggests that these personality traits are about 50% due to, say, behavior, due to genetic variance, and 50% due to environmentality. So about 50-50, right? Nature and nurture. When it comes to sexual orientation, again, not necessarily a personality trait here, but people who do study personality will often include this topic as an area of interest. The research into, say, the heritability of sexual orientation is very interesting, because there's lots of different results and lots of different studies, and the researchers will try to approach the topic from different perspectives. But hopefully by now, this far along in the chapter, you know that we're never going to find a gay gene, right? That's not how genes work. There's not a gene in you that you can flip on and off to turn you gay or not. That's not how genes work. But a lot of research will take a look at what proportion of, say, someone's sexuality, typically examining gays and lesbians, so homosexuality, what proportion of homosexuality could be accounted for by, say, heritability or your genes, and what proportion can be accounted for by the environment. That includes prenatal environment as well. So it's pretty controversial, as you can imagine, because gays and all members of the LGBTQ plus community, suffer discrimination and prejudice and being abandoned by families and disowned by their churches and their communities. And there's also, just until this summer, it was legal in many states in this country to fire somebody because they were gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. So this is an issue that's very politically charged. Gay marriage has only been, same-sex marriage has only been, legal in this country, the federal level, only for what, 5 years now? 6? No, yeah, 5-6 years now. So it's still, again, a controversial area of research. Current evidence suggests that genes may indirectly influence adult sexual orientation, but this goes with pretty much everything in terms of how genes have their influence. It's indirectly, right? So there's some evidence to suggest there might be a genetic component here. When it comes to say what kind of traits might be related to sexual orientation as in adulthood, it seems that childhood gender nonconformity is strongly related to adult sexual orientation. So kids who break gender norms, and of course some of those kids will grow up to be straight or bisexual or curious, but just because you have the tomboy or tomboy, you have girl like science and mechanics and building and shit. That doesn't mean that they're going to grow up to be a lesbian. But there does seem to be a strong correlation between kids who are willing to break gender norms. You have to remember the social pressures that are on children, that are on all of us, but particularly as kids, the type of social pressures that exist to keep us in line when it comes to gender expectations. So the kids who are willing to break them are probably doing so for a reason, right? Because you get punished when you break gender norms. When it comes to attitudes and preferences, what proportion of, say, attitudes and preferences are related to genetics? Well, there seems to be a wide variance in heritability of attitudes, meaning there's no simple answer. The research is kind of mixed when it comes to people's attitudes and preferences being heritable. So stable attitudes are generally regarded to be part of our personality, because we might not think of like attitudes, well, that's how I feel about something. Is that necessarily a personality trait? No, not a personality trait per se. Not all of them, right? Not all attitudes. But they tend to be regarded as kind of making up our personality, or certain attitudes being associated with certain personality traits. So it's fair to, I say it's fair to kind of study these. I think it's fair to study anything, right? Again, just be careful about how your results might be used to. So yeah, be careful how your results might be used by certain people. I'm just trying not to get political. This whole lecture, I'm just like biting my tongue throughout the whole thing, if you haven't noticed. So there tends to be wide variance. Some attitudes, like traditionalism, show some pretty high heritability, about 0.59. So that's a pretty strong correlation there, in terms of however these studies are measuring this. It could be done through twin studies that you might be getting this coefficient from, or through adoptive studies, family studies. We're saying overall across all the the research across all the methods, seems like traditionalism, you'll often, I think your book will refer to it as a conservatism. So, more conservative attitudes or more traditional attitudes, seem to be, pretty highly, heritable, where things like belief in God or some of these other types of attitudes show like no or very low heritability. So it's kind of a mixed bag out there. One study that I just have on my notes here that's not shown on the screen that I thought was interesting to include because it was a longitudinal study. So it basically followed a big sample of adoptive and non-adoptive children. So this longitudinal study followed 654 adopted and non-adopted children in the Colorado Adoption Project, and it revealed significant genetic influences on conservative attitudes, traditionalism, and significant genetic influence emerged as early as 12 years of age in this study. So, seems to be highly heritable, and seems to actually pop up at a pretty early age, which also suggests that it might be more genetic, or if not suggests, it gives a little bit more support to the idea that it's genetic. What else in my notes here? One other study, genes also appear to influence occupational preferences. So again, I thought this was worth mentioning because it's a large sample. In this one study of 435 adopted offspring and almost 11,000 genetic offspring. So 435 adopted offspring, almost 11,000 genetic offspring residing in Canada and the US. And in this one study, they had these participants respond to 14 different aspects of prospective jobs, using a scale from 1, that means that the job was not interesting to them at all, up to 100, which meant that the job was extremely interesting. So that was this one study just taking a look at adoptive children or adoptive offspring, genetic offspring, asking them to rate these different jobs on 14 different aspects, right? So what were the results? Well, 71% of the correlations were statistically significant for the genetic children, whereas only 3% of the correlations were significant for the adoptive children, suggesting that environment did not really create this effect, did not really create the similarity in terms of job prospects or the appeal of different jobs. It seems like this, just to sum it up, that say this occupational preference that we saw seemed to have, say, more occupational preferences might be more heritable than environmental, according to this study. I don't know the effect size. I couldn't tell you if these were highly heritable, but it certainly seems to be, more nature rather than nurture when it comes to job preferences. Thought that was kind of interesting. Not sure what to make of that. I gotta go find that original study and see what they did. When it comes to certain behaviors like drinking and smoking, both of which are, again, considered addictions. So, we can speak of them in terms of personality, generally speaking, but we wouldn't consider these personality traits. However, they are behaviors that might be manifestations of certain personality traits, right? So something like sensation seeking, extraversion, or neuroticism. I'd throw in there openness to experience, right? You just want to be open to trying things out, altering your consciousness. So we throw neuroticism in there as like a bad thing, but well, taking certain drugs, we're not talking about drugs here, drinking and smoking, but I'm sure there's research that has tried to determine the heritability of drug taking behavior, and of course I would ask, well, what kind of drugs are you talking about? If we're talking about things like LSD or psilocybin, mushrooms, or peyote, are we talking about psychedelics, essentially? I would consider, or I would imagine, people who score high on the trait of openness to experience would be more likely to use those drugs. I'm open to new experiences, that's for sure, but I never took psychedelics because I'm also very high in neuroticism. So I always, anytime I had the opportunity to trip on something, I'd start getting a panic attack because I'm like, oh my god, what if I have a bad trip? What if I have a bad trip? And then my friends are like, yeah, no, we ain't giving you this shit because now you got it all up in your head. You're going to have a bad trip, right? This is another example of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If I start telling myself I'm going to have a bad trip, and then I take these psychedelics, then I'm going to have a bad trip. Just while I'm already on this little rant about psychedelics, there's a ton of research that suggests that psychedelic drugs and dissociative drugs, such as ketamine, known as Special K on the street, probably known by a whole bunch of other things now, but also MDMA, have almost remarkable potential for fighting post-traumatic stress disorder and treatment-resistant depression, particularly ketamine. Number of studies, and I do a talk. If any of you are in Psych Club or in Psych-Hi, you want me to do like a virtual talk about this type of issue, the talk is focused mostly on cannabis use, the mental health benefits of cannabis use. So it's a mental marijuana talk, but I also spend quite a bit of time talking about psychedelics, so LSD and psilocybin in terms of treating addictions, and ketamine in terms of being pretty much the only treatment that works for people with treatment-resistant depression, and it takes them out of depression like that within a matter of half an hour to an hour, and the effects last for weeks. And if you think, I'm just being crazy here, type in ketamine clinic into Google. Open up a browser, open up Google, type in ketamine treatment center, and you're going to find a bunch of them in the tri-state area. So this is being used. Procter and Gamble, or was it Johnson and Johnson, are actually developing a drug. If I remember correctly, they actually just got FDA approval of an isomer of ketamine So basically it's ketamine without the fun part of it that they are now selling as a drug for treatment-resistant depression. If I'm not mistaken, it's about $3,000 for a drug that is almost exactly the same thing as ketamine, which has been a cheap generic drug for decades now, that is used as an anesthetic, mostly in veterinary settings. So let me know if you want me to do a talk. Again, if someone email me, I'll be happy to do one. Okay, when it comes to drinking and smoking, again, these might be behavioral manifestations of certain personality traits, and smoking and drinking habits tend to stabilize over time. So people often will pick up smoking and then quit smoking, or they'll pick up drinking. Say most people, not everyone, but most people will drink recreationally, but then sometimes you go through a difficult point in your life and you might be becoming not necessarily an alcoholic, but maybe a little too dependent on alcohol to get you through this tough time, using it as a coping mechanism. I believe the new DSM calls that alcohol use disorder. They're like, nah, you're not an alcoholic, but you're still probably drinking too much as a way to avoid dealing with the actual problem at hand. So we're not talking about cases like that if you're a social smoker or a social drinker or anything, but people who kind of become addicted to this stuff. And when you take a look at, family studies aren't really going to be that useful here, because chances are, if your parents are heavy drinkers and heavy smokers, I mean, you're exposed to that at a very young age. Kind of makes sense that you'd pick that up from the environment. But when we take a look at twin studies, and especially twin studies or studies of twins that were reared in the same household or reared apart, there seems to be some evidence for the heritability of drinking and smoking. So again, in this little note that I have here, the heritability studies of alcohol drinking are kind of mixed. Some studies find heritability for boys but not for girls, and then other studies show the complete opposite, for that it exists for girls but not for boys. But most studies show something in between, and it seems to be a moderate effect for both sexes. So about a correlation of 0.36 to 0.56 is kind of what the research shows, but they're not conclusive. There's differences in terms of what the research says, right? Okay, so then when it comes to the environmental influences, what's more important, the experiences that we share with our siblings in the environment, or the, say, experiences that we don't share in our environment with our siblings? So we're basically asking, is it the qualities of the shared environment, or those experiences we've had that were kind of unique to us? Which one is more important when it comes to the environmental influences on our personalities? So the same studies that suggest moderate heritability also suggest moderate environmental influences, right? So if a study is saying, well, smoking is about 50% heritable, well then it's saying, well, it's also 50% environmental as well. So let's keep that in mind. So personality characteristics show heritabilities in the range of, let's say, 30 to 50%, generally speaking. So they essentially are also showing that a substantial degree of somebody's personality is due to the environment or due to not her genetics. So again, there are two types of environmental influences: shared and non-shared. So shared environmental influences are when in a family environment, there are certain features of the environment that are shared by all the siblings. So an example might be the number of books that are in your home. That's shared between everyone who's in the house has the same number of books that are in the home. Non-shared environmental influence in a family environment. These are features of the environment that differ across siblings. So having different friends, having different teachers, going to different schools, being exposed to different music or whatever. These are the things that are not shared between siblings. So these are things that kind of, we do on our own or that are unique to us. So for most personality traits, the environment, again, as we've been saying, is going to exert a major influence. For most personality traits, though, the shared environment seems to have little impact. The environmental causes appear to be mostly of the non-shared variety. So that's kind of interesting when you think about it. It's that it's not necessarily so the similarities in personalities, or let's say let's say if the environment can account for certain aspects of my personality, it's actually the things in my environment that made me different from my siblings that account for my personality, not the things that we had in common, let's say, right? So we know that, again, the environment exerts a major influence, but like which of these environmental characteristics matter seems to be the non-shared experiences. In adoption studies, for example, the adoption studies show that the average correlation for personality variables between adopted siblings who share much of the same environment, but share no genes, is only about 5%, right? So when you take a look at these adoption studies and they're examining the average correlation between personality variables among the non-genetically related siblings, it's only about 5%, right? For those shared environments, which suggests in this finding that genetics is playing a role, but also suggesting that it's really the non-shared environments or non-shared aspects of the environment that is what's most contributing to our personalities. Okay, so when we talk about this genotype environment interaction, so what does this refer to? It refers to the differential response of individuals with different genotypes to the same environments, meaning our genes and our environment are going to interact in different ways for different people. So differential responses of individuals with different genotypes to the same environment. That's what we mean when we talk about this genotype environment interaction. Example here, task performance of introverts versus extroverts in loud versus noisy conditions. Let me explain on that. Let's take, for example, introverts and extroverts. So introverts will tend to perform better on cognitive tasks when there's little stimulation going on in the room. So they tend to perform better on these cognitive tasks when it's a quieter room, when there's not a whole lot of distractions around. And they tend to do more poorly on these types of cognitive tests when there's lots of distractions around, when there's lots of, noise and lots of people coming and going. So the introvert, we would, say if there's a genetic component, they could do well if they're in an environment that suits them, right? Or they could do poorly if they're in an environment that doesn't suit them personality-wise. And the same with extroverts. We see the same type of response in these types of studies on cognitive tests. So, people who are extroverted like noisiness and like people and kind of like, hustle and bustling type stuff. So, they don't mind at all if, in terms of their scores, they don't do any worse when there's noise, loud noises, and lots of distractions in the room. They tend to be fine, with that. However, their scores will actually go down on certain, cognitive tests when they're put in a very silent room with no distractions and no stimulation whatsoever. Right? So again, our genes our genes do interact with the environment to produce certain results, certain outcomes. So keep that in mind. Individual differences interact with the environment to affect performance on particular tasks. But I would extend that to many, if not all, outcomes. They're going to likely be a result of your genes and your environment. So one other way that we can kind of look at this that's a little bit more involved than, say, just a genotype environment interaction is the genotype environment correlation. So this means that, or refers to, differential exposure of individuals with different genotypes to different environments. So a genotype environment correlation can be positive or negative. I'm trying to think of another way of putting this. Well, let's take a look at a couple of examples. This might make more sense here. So there's basically three types of genotype environmental correlations: passive, reactive, or active. When we talk about a passive genotype environment correlation here, the passive correlation, this is where parents provide both the genes and the environment to children. Says here, yet the children do nothing to obtain that environment, but that's not for lack of want. The children are not necessarily seeking out this environment because it's already being provided to them. What's an example of this? Let's say an example, if we take a kid who has a genotype, who, genetically, they tend to have a high verbal ability. So they tend to be really good with words and maybe like languages and reading and talking and all that stuff. So something about their genes that just make them more verbal. And the parents might notice this as even from a pretty young age. They might notice this in their child, and provide the child with lots of books for them to read, and they might engage them more in conversations, and might give them word games and crossword puzzles and stuff. So the parents might do this or provide this type of environment to a child who is showing this higher verbal propensity than say they would for a child who is showing, lesser, a lesser amount of this type of verbal activity. So in this case, the child doesn't have to do anything. They were, quote unquote, given the genes that produced their high verbal abilities or high verbal interests, and the parents are also providing an environment that encourages this high verbal ability, right? So how does this let's say work? How does this affect say personality? Well, you kind of getting the genes and the environment to kind of promote this this personality development. So there's a correlation in this example, correlation between the children's verbal ability and the number of, say, books in their house, or the number of conversations that the parents have with them. But it's passive. The child's not doing anything, right? It's kind of just bestowed upon them. This is in contrast to, say, a reactive type of correlation here. So the parents or other people, caretakers, could respond to children differently depending on the child's genotype. So here we have an example of babies who like cuddling, and their mother's cuddling behaviors. So let's expand on that a bit there. So when it comes to the reactive genotype environment correlation, this again occurs when parents or caretakers are responding to children differently based on that child's genotype. So some babies just really like to be touched and really like to be cuddled, right? They'll laugh and they'll giggle, and they're very responsive, very reactive to their parents' touch or caregivers' touch. So let's say these are the cuddler types. Something about their genetic makeup makes them like being cuddled compared to, let's say, other children who might not be all that into it, or it's not really doing much for them, the whole cuddling thing. They don't get as excited, it's not as enjoyable. And maybe it was something about their genetic makeup that makes them less interested in cuddling or having that type of physical contact. Well, parent or caretaker is likely to notice this pretty quickly, pretty early on, and they will start cuddling more with the children, let's say, who like it, who enjoy being cuddled, who are the cuddlers, and they will cut down on the cuddling type of behavior to the children who are the non-cuddlers. So essentially, we're still getting the genes from the parents, but the environment is going to change depending on how, say, in this case, the child is reacting to the particular environment. So this example of the cuddling, or cuddlers versus non-cuddlers, kind of illustrates the reactive correlation, which is achieved because people are going to be reacting to children differently, at least partially based on the child's genetic predispositions, right? Their whether they like cuddling or not. So the child, in this case, is having some impact on the environment and how people are responding to them. And then we have an active genotype environment correlation. And in this case, it occurs when a person with a particular genotype creates or seeks out a particular environment. So it's not being provided to them in any way, not passively or even reactively. So they have to go seek it out. So we could say people who have a high sensation seeking propensity, people who high sensation seekers, might have to expose themselves to some risky environments to get that sensation, to get that thrill. Like they might have to go skydiving or bungee jumping or do some of this type of crazy stuff to get that sensation, to get that thrill, because they're not getting it in the environment. Either the parents aren't providing it passively to them, or reactively to them. Another example might be, highly intelligent, say individuals or highly intelligent kids whose parents aren't actively or reactively bringing them to the museum or libraries. So the child might have to actively seek out these museums and the libraries and lectures and read books and all that stuff by themselves. So I'm sure there's some of you in this class, just because it's a huge class, and anytime you get a group of people over 30, right, the data starts taking on a normal distribution, so you kind of start making some assumptions with reasonable accuracy. So I'm sure there's some of you who were, very intelligent. I mean, you're in college now, and in a pretty decent college at that. So you're certainly not dumb, or you wouldn't be here. But some of you were likely pretty smart kids, but grew up in a household that really didn't encourage intelligence, or actually maybe even look down upon it. I didn't have books in my house growing up. I was not taken to museums or libraries or anything like that. I had to walk 3 or 4 miles like almost every other day to go get books for the library. I had to seek all that stuff out myself, right? And I'm sure there's others in the class who had to do the same. Some of you were just smart, and your parents are smart, and they provided an environment that that kind of encouraged your intellectual exploration, and you didn't have to do anything about it. And then there might be, so that would be a passive example, right? And then there's some of you who, have some genetic component to intelligence, so you were smart, but it took your parents to notice that you were interested in these things, and then they provided that environment for you. That would be reactive. So hopefully that helps. This makes sense a little bit. My mind is not good. I don't feel well. I'm hoping it's not that thing going around here. Okay, so getting into this idea of molecular genetics that your book talks about towards the end of the chapter here. This is kind of the most recent development in behavioral genetics, is to examine molecular, or to explore molecular genetics. And what is this? Well, these are techniques that are designed to identify specific genes associated with personality traits. Ooh, that is now like, if you're social, if you lean more towards the social psychology spectrum, side of the spectrum, you're probably already kind of uncomfortable with this chapter to begin with. Now, if you're like me, you must be like, really? We're going to look for particular genes, like an extroverted gene? Is there an intelligence gene too? Like, really, just a single gene now? That's kind of what molecular genetics are looking for. They're looking for specific genes that are associated with personality traits. And to be fair to them, it might not be a single gene. It could be, multiple genes, but specific genes themselves, right? So when it comes to how this is done, I don't know. I'm not a biologist for sure, so it's way too technical. Even if I did know exactly how this was done, way too technical to try to describe in this class. And for the purposes of this class, we don't need to know. But the idea is to identify a particular gene or allele that might be responsible, or if it exists, that might make somebody more likely, might predispose them to have certain personality traits. So the most frequently examined gene that is used in terms of identifying personality traits is the D4DR. Well, totally got that backwards. The DRD4 gene. And this is located on the short arm of chromosome 11, and it codes for dopamine receptors. So it's another way we could just say is that this particular gene is responsible for how we respond to dopamine. Let's keep it that. Let's keep it there, as simple as that. So most frequently, it's examined in terms of what's the association between this DRD4 gene and a personality trait that involves sensation seeking. Remember, sensation seeking or novelty seeking, sensation seeking is something that's associated with perhaps a number of different personality traits, or if we're going to count say drug use or drinking and smoking as personality traits, which they're not, but they get included in here. Dopamine would certainly be related to those types of behaviors as well. What is dopamine? Well, it's the reward neurotransmitter. Dopamine is what makes us feel good. For smoking, right? Nicotine releases dopamine in the brain, what makes us feel good. Gambling, right? Getting that type of rush, you get this little reward of dopamine. Basically, it's there to say, do it again, right? And that could become problematic because it starts to create urges, or it starts to create these types of bad habits. But dopamine is the reward neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and reward. So you get a nice dose of dopamine during sex, during, like I said, gambling, smoking, even checking your phone, right? Checking to, if you post something on Twitter, and every time somebody likes your tweet, you get a little bit of dopamine. That's why we're constantly checking. We post something, and then 30 seconds later, we're waiting for that response. We're waiting for that little hit of dopamine to hit us. So these are all like a little reward that we're waiting for there. So when it comes to, say, long repeats or short repeat versions of this gene, just understand, there are different versions of this gene, and individuals with the quote-unquote long repeat version are higher, or tend to be higher on the novelty seeking trait or novelty seeking scale than individuals with the short repeat version of this gene. So this gene might be related to certain behaviors and personality characteristics that involve dopamine, the release of dopamine. So if we really think about it, we're talking about an indirect effect on personality, right? In terms that this gene, having this gene is not going to make you, a risk taker directly. What it's going to do is make you more susceptible to dopamine, or make you more have more dopamine receptors, or produce more dopamine. And having this extra dopamine, or this extra sensitivity to dopamine, might make you engage in these types of behaviors, or develop these types of personality traits. There have been several failures when replicating these associations, and the associations can be kind of weak when they are replicated. So, in other words, it's really not that convincing so far, right? But to be fair, this is a brand new, past 20, 30 years really, area here. So it's really in its infancy. And again, I don't need to shit on the basic concept of it. If we can identify genes that cause pre-genetic dispositions to certain diseases, or certain mental illnesses, or destructive behaviors, and we're able to learn how to treat those types of things, and I'm all for it. When it comes to, let's say, the politics of behavioral genetics, clearly, like I said, just how I've been trying to choose my words very carefully here to be as least political as possible. I'm not sure I was successful at that, but it's a pretty controversial topic, and I have no problem talking about controversy. I just don't want to get on a soapbox and start preaching to you for 3 hours here. But one of the reasons is that it's controversial is that it goes against, this idea that personality traits are heritable goes against the prevailing environmentalist view. So it's the prevailing view that when it comes to personality, the environment is important, largely important, right? So that our personalities are largely determined by socialization practices, such as parenting style, and how we were treated, the experiences that we went through when we were younger. So people are worried about political and ideological misuse of behavioral genetic findings, and this might actually be why I'm more meh about this now is because of the political climate that we're living in. Uh, 10 years ago, I mean, I studied this stuff in depth in graduate school, and I didn't really I didn't have a visceral reaction to it. I agreed with some of it, disagreed with most of it. It's kind of the same way as I feel about it now. Even during this lecture, I guess now it's just like a visceral feeling because our country is just very much divided on racial lines and ethnic lines and sociodemographic lines, and we see a resurgence of some of these nationalistic social Darwinian ideologies, white nationalism, and all this other sort of stuff. So maybe I'm just burned out about this. There's a lot of controversy surrounding the idea of intelligence and how well, number one, what intelligence even is, but also that intelligence is somehow genetic or is heritable. This is a controversy that's been around for quite a long time. With the started before this, but basically the publication of a book called The Bell Curve, which was, I believe, in the 1970s, and it was, it's just a collection. This book, a collection of some pretty shoddy research that made a lot of assumptions and didn't take into account a whole bunch of societal, environmental things going on at the time, that made the argument that black people and brown people as a group, it's a group separate from whites. It essentially made the argument that white people have superior intelligence, and backed it up with a whole bunch of statistical data. However, they didn't put that data into context, and there's a number of problems that exist with IQ, just the notion of IQ to begin with, but also how it's measured, right? When you talk about IQ, from a evolutionary standpoint, intelligence is your ability to learn from past mistakes and to adapt to new environments. That's it. Not if you know how to do math in your head or figure out a word problem or something like that. What if you come from a culture or an environment where you didn't get the type of schooling that is often required to do well on these types of IQ tests. So IQ tests tend to be biased, and the people who developed them were old white dudes, and I'm one of them, so no offense, right? Like I get it there, but it was also during a time where it's not like racism is gone now, but during a time when racism was like overt racism was much more accepted than it is now, right? So, and people weren't really, the researchers and the people developing these tests weren't really taking into account that hey, maybe it's segregation that's causing problem. Maybe it's unequal treatment and unequal opportunities that are causing these differences in tests. Or hey, maybe it's like we're just asking stuff that kind of really only white people study, right, in schools. whatever the case may be. Um, Also, just taking the racial aspects of or potential or likely racial biases of intelligence tests out of the equation. Intelligence as a concept is, again, kind of bullshit the way that it's measured, because it changes all the time, right? So the when it comes to, say, intelligence and trying to think of this as a personality variable, you're basically saying that genes, or that some people are genetically more intelligent than others. What is that saying? Ultimately, it's saying that some people are genetically superior to other people, and there's the notion of intelligence should not allow someone to do that, because the notion of intelligence is kind of bullshit. We know that it's not heritable, or that at least it's not 100% heritable, right? Easily we know this because of the Flynn effect. What's the Flynn effect? Well, the Flynn effect is just the fact that on average, the average IQ score has been going up 3 points every decade in the United States. So there's clearly something else driving these IQ scores, or, IQ scores, that's not genetics. So, but we have to be careful in terms of how genetic research into people's personalities, how it's conducted, and how that research is how those results are interpreted, and how those results may be used. And like I said, probably piss off some scientists by saying that, but because we're not supposed to be concerned about how our results are used, we should only be concerned with getting at the truth. But you could just think of all the implications that exist with this. And again, when it comes to sexual orientation, that's another area in the behavioral genetic realm that's very controversial, because for some reason, if it's somehow quote unquote not your fault for being gay or trans, then society is more accepting of it. And I mean, there's plenty of social research that kind of shows that to be true there. That people who saw homosexuality, this is what the research was focused on, didn't really include transgenderism in those studies, but people who saw gay people as being born that way, right? Means that, well, it wasn't their fault, we shouldn't blame them. It's not because they're sinful and evil and stuff. Compared to people who believed that sexual orientation was a choice, or that it was because of environmental factors, like you had problems with your dad or your mom or something as a kid, and that turned you gay. So those people tend to be less accepting of equal rights for gays and lesbians, and we're starting to see the same issue now with transgender folk. So there's some issues, political issues that is butting heads with science. But when it comes to sexual orientation, so anybody who's gay or lesbian or bi or trans or anything in between, and your parents have a problem with it, either way, it's nature or nurture, it's their fault, right? So either you were born that way, it's genetic, and you got it from your parents, so it's their fault, or it was environmental, which means your parents did something to make you that way. So if they give you any shit for that, tell them either way it's their fault, right? Okay. we're almost done here. So, like I said before, because scientific research can be misused for political and ideological goals, scientists have a special responsibility. We should be cognizant of how our results and our research might be used. But science can be separate from values. That's for sure. Should we not study something because it might have a negative effect on a group, or it might lead to something negative happening in society? Should we stifle the pursuit of knowledge? I don't know. I don't know, right? There's the idea that knowledge is better than operating in ignorance. So even if our research could have some potential short-term negative effects, that ultimately it's going to be better to have this information than to not have this information. But I'd say let's see what happens to our country and our society. I did believe this statement here: knowledge is better than operating in ignorance. But maybe I'm just too sad these days, and too depressed at what I see happening in our country and in our world, to fully embrace that statement now. All right, so just to summarize this chapter, most compelling evidence for heritability and environmentality of personality comes from findings that were generated across various methods. So family studies, twin studies, all of these different methods, different approaches. This is where the research, or the evidence for heritability and environmentality comes from, not from a single study. And again, this is one of the reasons why we have to speak in generalities and in estimates. Nobody knows how much of anything is when it comes to personality, right? How much is heritable and how much is environmental. We can make guesstimates based on research findings. Also, personality variables such as extroversion and neuroticism have moderate heritability, as do drinking, smoking attitudes, and sexual orientation. Again, not sure that's a personality trait, but certainly related to who a person is, right? So these studies suggest that these same variabilities have moderate to strong environmentality as well. And again, environmentality includes the prenatal environment, so development in the womb. Also, much of the environmental influence is due to non-shared variables. So much of the influence that an environment has on us is due to the variables that we don't share with our siblings. And finally, genotype, environment, interaction, and correlation, as well as the new field of molecular behavior genetic analysis, are promising areas for future research and future work. They're still very much in their infancy, and for now, we treat them as interesting, promising areas for future work, and take all those findings with a grain of salt. But at least I'm biased against this type of stuff as more of a social psychologist. So, of course, feel free to disagree with me on that last point. Okay, I'm done for now. So I will see you all again soon. Sooner rather than later. Take care.